Well, good morning to everyone in the Western Hemisphere, and good evening, good day to everyone in the Eastern Hemisphere. I'm Ken Pollock. I am the Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute, and welcome to another MEI policy briefing. This one, another unexpected one. This is on the record, being recorded, and for that purpose, let me just remind everyone who may look at this at some later time that this is Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Washington time. So please keep that in mind. We're bound by the limitations of the information available to us at this moment. I'm joined this morning by two of my MEI colleagues, Alex Vatanka, a very well-known expert on Iran, and Brian Katulis, an expert on a whole variety of different issues, but who is also the host of Taking the Edge Off the Middle East podcast and who writes a weekly analysis called Making Sense of U.S. Foreign Policy. We're going to try to deal with a variety of different issues related to and centered around the American decision last night to join in the Israeli air campaign against Iran's nuclear sites. Obviously, there are a lot of different issues here. And what I'd like to do is we're going to start with some introductory remarks by each of the three of us, and then we'll shift over to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you're welcome to do so. Please do so by using the Q&A function on Zoom. If you're not familiar with it, you can find it at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There is a Q&A button located right between the green share button and the show captions button. If you click on that Q&A button, it will bring up a dialog box. You can type your questions in there, and I will ask those questions to the three of us over the course of the webinar. But I want to start by asking Alex, Brian, and I will also take a turn at this to kind of put some of the most important issues on the table that we're wrestling with. And I want to start with Alex, and I want to preface Alex's remarks. I want to put this in the form of a question, Alex, where right now, after the American decision to join the conflict and the bombing of the sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan, there are obviously two big sets of issues that the U.S. needs to grapple with and that are ultimately related to Iran's own decision-making. On the one hand, there is the issue of horizontal escalation, of Iranian decision to retaliate against the United States or against our allies in the region, most likely, but potentially beyond it as well. So that's one set of issues that obviously people are very, very concerned about. But there's another set of issues as well that I think fewer people recognize as being important, but that really are of tremendous importance that we also need to get a sense of how Iran might respond. And that's the future of Iran's own nuclear program. We don't fully know, and I'll talk about that in my remarks, exactly what the damage is to Iran's nuclear program, where it stands. But a critical issue out there is how the Iranian regime reacts to both the Israeli campaign and now the American strikes. Does it respond by deciding to go all in to acquire a nuclear weapon as fast as it possibly can? Or is it open to diplomacy? And does it move in the opposite direction, decide now we absolutely can't get a nuclear weapon, we shouldn't, because it will simply provoke more strikes? So both of these issues, horizontal escalation, what do the Iranians do in the immediate term toward the United States, and then this question of the future of Iran's nuclear program and reconstitution, these, I think, are the most important issues with regard to Iranian decision-making. Give us your sense of both of them, Alex.
Thank you, Ken. Great to be with you and with Brian, and looking forward to the questions from the audience. Look, Ken, obviously this happened for us living here in the Eastern United States. We got the news last night. There was no reaction for a few hours. So I slept, I got up in the morning, and I was picking up reactions from Iran, limited as they are because of the internet blackout. But right away, one of the things that hit me was seems to be like the bombing of Japan moment. Again, I don't know if that's a good comparison, but it's like it's time to make a decision. Do you want to stay in this fight or not? And I didn't get, obviously, from official media, any sense that there is anything like a debate about what to do next. And that doesn't surprise any of us, right? They've just been hit. They're not going to talk about surrendering, certainly not at this early stage, although that might be on the card. So we had Abbas Arafti, the foreign minister in Turkey. He was pretty much, from what I could tell, leaving the door open for diplomacy. But he did say something that caught my attention. He said that obviously the prospects for diplomacy working will depend very much on Iran's retaliation, right? And then he kind of said, well, he didn't say anything. He didn't hint at what that retaliation might look like and its impact on the region. So, and the question then you're left with is who's going to make that decision? Because it raises that question of who is making decisions right now in Iran, where I'm assuming senior leaders like Ayatollah Khamenei are in hiding or not essentially having a free hand in communicating in terms of the big decisions. So Khamenei is missing in action. You would assume that the Revolutionary Guards, the ones that are not busy trying not to get assassinated, and what we call the technocratic part of the regime, those are the folks around President Pezeshkian, that they're the ones that are in the driver's seat right now in terms of that decision. So just before I came on, I was listening to J.D. Vance, and he was making the point that, we still want peace. We want peace with Iran. It's it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of the reaction there'll be inside Iran. But let me say this, Ken. For now, though, I don't see any, and again, shouldn't surprise anybody, no overt sign of a crack in the ranks of the regime. I haven't seen much in terms of public opinion. I am assuming public opinion is going to initially be taking a very nationalist sort of a take on this, that the country has now been attacked. People are already making comparisons to 1953 and all sorts of things. But then this is something also we saw when Israel first attacked Iran on June 13th. That was also the case. But very quickly, people started asking the question, how do we get here? So that people started looking at Khamenei and his policies for sort of creating the conditions for why we ended up in this situation. Let me also say, as far as diplomacy is concerned, Ken, it's really important for folks that have any leverage or access to the Iranians to obviously try and shape their calculations. We, as you know, Ken, at the Middle East Institute, we've had repeated trips to the Sultanate of Oman, Brian, myself. We know the good folks in Oman and elsewhere in the region are trying really hard. They're doing it because they really want to help de-escalate. They also have a lot at stake if this conflict gets out of hand, right? So they're doing it for their own well-being as well going forward. Very quickly, in terms of possible Iranian actions that are being mentioned, the usual ones everyone's seen in the media, that playing nice with the United States is not going to work. That's what the message from the hardliners seems to be. The two nuclear states, United States and Israel, attacked a non-nuclear state, and there is barely any kind of reaction in the international community. So what is the worth of international community? Get out of the NPT, and to the best of you can, go and build whatever you have to do to defend yourself. That seems to be what the hardliners are saying. But again, to my point earlier, I don't know if they're going to be able to make that final decision. Again, I don't want to get into the sort of things everyone's been reading the last few days in terms of Iran's options to what they can hit, U.S. bases, closing the Strait of Hormuz, but nothing certain. The Iranians seem to be waiting for international reaction. They won't get much from what I can tell. And I suspect what they're going to do if they don't attack the United States directly, which at this point I'm doubtful. I actually think they might do less than they did in 2020 following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, if you remember, to hit the U.S. base in Iraq. I think they might even do less than that. Because they really don't want to bring the United States into this conflict. So focusing on Israel seems to be what they're maybe hoping to do, because they're banking that Trump doesn't want to get into this war. And if they can keep him out, that's what they want. They're are very sensitive to American public opinion. They see the U.S. public opinion doesn't want to see the U.S. drawn into this war. And why should Iran give President Trump any sort of reason to do that by attacking U.S. forces? If Israel stays the course, you've heard this before, they're going to hit Dimona nuclear plant and so forth. Again, how much of that is real? How much of that is brinkmanship aimed to shape the other guy's calculations, in this case, Israel? But you certainly have plenty of folks in Tehran these days who are kind of subscribing to that. If madman theory works for Trump, why wouldn't it work for us type of thing? Very quickly, I know I'm talking more than you probably wanted me to, Ken, but I'll wrap up here. the big question, if you're sitting in Tehran right now, is uncertainty in terms of what the US really wants. Because if you're an Iranian official right now, do you have any reason to trust anything that comes out of the White House, right? Because they've been deceived repeatedly, right? So at this point, JD Vance and President Trump are staying and tweeting regime change isn't on the agenda. But I don't think the Iranians are convinced. I don't see any hard evidence of this, that that's on the cards. But again, just going back to the interview just a few hours ago that Vice President J.D. Vance had, he said peace is right there around the corner. Two things he asked for: no Iranian nuclear weapons program, and do not attack U.S. forces. But here's my question, Ken. What if Iran does what I suspect it might do, focuses on attacking Israel? At what point does the United States, when Prime Minister Netanyahu calls and says, you need to come back and help me out here, because I don't know how many missiles the Iranians have left, but they're continuing to fire missiles at Israel. And if that stays the case, remains the case, then it's not that hard to imagine the Israelis again pick up the phone and say, we need help. And then would air strikes from above do the job? Or do you really have to have another fundamental look at this and say it's about handling this situation at the root causes, which is the political nature of the regime of the Islamic Republic, which is basically code for you need to have regime change, right? But I've been saying to media, last time Iran was occupied was 1941 to 1945 by the British and the Soviet Union. So I don't know if this country certainly has the appetite to occupy this country. I don't know where we're going to go. But at this point, uncertainty in terms of what U.S. end mission in this game is not necessarily helpful. In terms of getting the Iranians to decide what should be their next step in this conflict. And the very last thing I say, Ken, obviously what Khamenei would love to see is U.S. boots on the ground. Because that he gets his guerrilla warfare. The only chance they have at making the United States actually suffer casualties, right? That's what they're waiting for. And then you will see public opinion in the Muslim world being incited to the extent successful by the Iranians. So you can see that it might be something that they are entertaining in their minds. But again, it goes back to what they fundamentally think U.S. end mission is: regime change, or just slap the U.S. or the Iranians around and then move on. I don't know which one of those two scenarios are more realistic, but I'm not sure if the Iranians know either. So let me stop there.
That was great, Alex, and I really appreciate that, unpacking some of the decisions and the thinking that may have been going on in Tehran. I think it's great. I actually want to pick up on that in my remarks. But before I do so, Brian, as I said, you have expertise in a whole variety of different subjects. I'd like you to address at least two areas I think of real importance. Obviously, I think there'll be more when we get into the Q&A. But first off, the domestic U.S. political considerations, right? This is now a big deal. We've got splits in the Republican Party, in the president's constituency, his base, over Iran. And obviously, the Democrats too, right? You've got Iran hawks in the Democratic Party, but you've also got doves, and you got a lot of people who just don't like President Trump. So take us through that. And then, you've got a tremendous range of contacts all throughout the Middle East. Would love to know what your sense is of the regional reaction to the American decision to join the war, at least at a preliminary level.
Great. Thanks, Ken. And thanks, Alex. It's great to be with both of you, and thank all of the audience for tuning in on a Sunday morning. You might want to go to church and say a prayer, or go to the gas station to fill up your tanks, given all the maximum uncertainty we might be able to be experiencing here. But a couple of points just on the domestic scene, because it is important. And when we engage in combat operations and things that put American lives at risk, I'm of the view that it's important to have as much of a maximum consensus here at home, but unfortunately we don't. And then I'll say a few things about the region. First, the state of America today, the morning after this strike, is still very distracted. And I can't highlight this enough, is that when you look at broader metrics of US public opinion polling, though the Middle East is important, and certainly the war that Israel and Iran are currently engaged in has ticked up in terms of its attention and focus, we are deeply distracted by our own issues here at home, the economic issues, the social, cultural warfare issues, immigration. So on the eve, or actually a day into the war that Israel began by striking Iran about 10 days ago, there were massive protests across the United States. You may remember this. These weren't protests like we saw in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War or even the 1991 Persian Gulf War. These were protests that were about our domestic issues, on Trump's harsh immigration policies, deep concerns about where we're going in terms of his overreaches on executive authority, which this action last night may be that, and we'll be debating a lot of that. But we're very distracted, and not that the Middle East is unimportant, and certainly if things go really wrong in the region, and if gas prices go up, and I know, Ken, you've been doing tons of webinars with our energy policy experts, but we're distracted from this. So this is not like after post 9/11 when the Iraq War was happening and people are in the streets. And that's I think a dangerous scenario for a number of reasons. So we're distracted. Second, we're divided. Obviously, a lot is red versus blue. And most big public policy issues are within that context. Ken, I'm glad you raised these divisions within both the Republican and Democratic parties. I actually think for the last several years, there's been a new spectrum when it comes to the politics of national security, and the old labels that we use, neocons or liberal interventionists and things like this, they just need to be discarded, because Trump himself and the people around him in his second term in particular are changing those dynamics in a big way. So we're divided red versus blue and within both parties. But interesting metric, I don't know if you saw this before the U.S. military action last night, the Washington Post put out their latest survey in terms of the policy options. And what Trump did last night actually was opposed before it happened by 45% of Americans. So 45% opposed to military strikes of the sort we saw last night, 25% supportive. But here's the key number, is the 30%, the unsure. And as we've seen in other instances of using military combat and operations, it really depends on the outcomes. Not only the success of the strike and whether the nuclear program was obliterated, as President Trump claimed, which was something different than what his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff just said this morning at an 8 a.m. press conference. He was a bit more hedged. He said we don't have the bomb damage assessments, but Americans are divided. They're skeptical of the use of force, especially in the Middle East. In that same poll, there's strong support for trying to find a diplomatic pathway. Really quickly, on Republicans. Republicans are divided from their so-called MAGA base, those who are skeptical about any sort of intervention. It's interesting that they put J.D. Vance out there on the Sunday shows this morning, because he's voiced a lot of those arguments coming from that side of their own spectrum. But I think the thing to watch really carefully is this notion, and if it's true, these press reports are true, that the pre-briefing on this operation was not given to the full gang of eight, which is the two leaders from both parties in the House and the Senate, and then the chairs of the intel committees, but only given to the Republicans. I'm not sure that's accurate. It sort of raised my eyebrows, because if that's the case, then there's serious trust and confidence issues between the parties on these issues, that Trump was only willing to, and his team was only willing to share this with Republicans. And that's, I think, could accelerate this partisan ideological division, both between the parties, but within. Quickly, the Democrats, I think they understandably are concerned about war powers, and there's been measures, which you'll hear this coming week in the Senate and the House, that they'll introduce a little too little, a little too late in trying to constrain the executive branch's options. But this is a feature of the debate, because we still have checks and balances in our system. We still have a legislative branch. We still have a judicial branch. We still have an executive branch. But the executive branch, as we've known for the last couple of decades, has increasingly been on steroids when it comes to national security authorities. That Congress, in many ways, has given wide berth to presidents, whether they're Democrat or Republican, on a range of issues. And again, my conclusion, and I'll close here on the domestic, is that it really depends on how all this plays out, what Iran decides to do, whether there's a wider cataclysmic sort of scenario. But we're already in the second Trump administration on uncharted territory when it comes to policy and politics of national security. And if true that he only briefed Republicans going into this in advance, that also, I think, will accelerate sort of those divisions between the parties. Really quickly on the region, and I've spent a lot of my early morning talking to friends from across the region in Jordan and Saudi and Emirates. Just three main points, I would say. Number one, quite clearly the ball's in Iran's court right now, and Alex articulated this clearly. The decision of the supreme leader and those around him and what they decide to do in terms of actions will shape everything henceforth, right? But the main sort of mode is not jubilation. I think there's no love lost about the regime in Tehran and its nuclear program, but it's more hunkering down, because the memories of what happened under the first Trump administration and also a bit under the Biden administration, something you wrote about, Ken, with a couple of colleagues, about the end of the Carter Doctrine. The memories that the U.S. really did not have Saudi Arabia's back in 2019 when Iranian groups struck their oil facility in Abqaiq. So there's a hunkering down, hoping for the best. And then I think a very, very important quiet effort, which is my last point, reinforcing something Alex said, what we heard in Oman when he and I were there in February, but then also in May with a larger group, is that there's a strong desire not only for de-escalation, but for some sort of diplomatic solution. And here's where I'll close, is that yes, President Trump last night ended his statement saying that we want to go on a path to peace. Yes, J.D. Vance reiterated that talking point. Even Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, said it this morning at the 8 a.m. press conference. But it's my assessment that I don't think they actually have a game plan in the Trump administration to get from where we are right now to some form of a negotiated settlement. And it's also my take, and Alex, I know agrees with this, because he and I put out a report under MEI's banner in January of this past year that was titled Beyond Maximum Pressure, right? You can look it up. But our argument was that whatever the United States does, and here it's done something dramatic, it needs actually to build its network of partners, not only on the military front, which we've done quite well, and Ken, you work on this quite a lot, our strong relationship with CENTCOM, but we actually need to build that diplomatic pathway with partners in the Gulf, in particular, those like Oman or Saudi Arabia or the UAE, who have tried to develop some form of a more functional relationship with the regime in Tehran. Why is that important? This is where I'll close. It's important is if we're serious about actually avoiding more conflict and seeing this cycle of violence between Israel and Iran continue, which is continuing as we speak right now, we actually need to work by, with, and through those partners diplomatically. In part because, as Alex will tell you, the regime in Tehran, for sure, if it didn't trust the Trump administration before this strike, I think there's zero confidence and trust. So we're going to have a team effort, and a team effort that requires collective diplomacy. And I'll end on this sort of sour, pessimistic note. I don't know if you've noticed with Trump's trade wars and how he's dealing with China and things like this, is that it's not really part of the source code of this administration to work in collective action with other countries. But it's my hope, and I put it out there as a think tank analyst, that somebody would listen to some of these partners who don't want a bigger war with Iran here, who in fact want there to be negotiated settlement, and would like that the Trump administration not just use it as a talking point, but actually develop an action plan for that. I'll close there.
That's great, Brian. Both you and Alex made a number of terrific points. And I want to pick up on both of them to just frame some issues moving forward. First point, we don't know what the American strike accomplished. We've heard the initial briefings. I did look at the satellite photographs of Fordo. There are a couple of holes, and it's clear that the surface Earth has shifted, but I find it very difficult to tell what the extent of the damage that was done to Fordo. And quite frankly, I am going to be surprised if the U.S. intelligence community has a really good read on what happened to Fordo. We obviously know the capabilities of those weapons and the fact that, it looks like we put multiple munitions down the same shaft. That's obviously a good sign. But we don't know for certain what wound up happening down at the bottom. There's also an initial Iranian response, which is that there was damage to Fordo, but that damage is not irreversible. The Iranian regime doesn't have a very good track record for honesty. And it could be that, yes, that is an admission that there was damage done there. That could be all subterfuge. The Iranian regime at this moment in time has absolutely no incentive to be truthful about what happened in Fordo. This could be diminishing or trying to downplay the amount of damage that was done to Fordo. It could be exaggerating the amount of damage that was done to Fordo. The regime has incentives to do both, right? It's all about what the regime wants to project to the United States and the rest of the world, and we don't really know what that is at this moment in time. We should also recognize that even if the United States did wipe out Fordo, finish off Natanz, finish off Esfahan, that doesn't necessarily mean the end of the Iranian nuclear program. This is the point that I raised with Alex. This is the point that Alex was discussing his own points. Iran has a tremendous amount of knowledge about how to build nuclear weapons at this point in time. Right? And we have to recognize that even with all of the damage that Israel has done in terms of killing Iranian nuclear scientists, no one is ever going to be able to assassinate Iran back to nuclear ignorance. It's simply not possible. Right? If the Iranians would like to do so, they will be able to reconstitute. Again, they have the knowledge of how to do so, but let's go beyond that. We don't know where Iran's highly enriched uranium is, and the Israelis estimated that they had enough to build 10 nuclear weapons. Beyond that, they have got a lot of uranium feedstock, which they can turn into bomb-grade uranium. They had a huge number of centrifuges that were unaccounted for. They weren't all at Natanz or Fordo, and they also know how to build centrifuges. And the truth is, it's not that hard to build centrifuges. And let's go one step further, that the Iranians announced earlier this month that they had a new top secret enrichment facility, which Western experts have speculated are at this Kolan Gazla facility not far from Natanz, but also inside a mountain, even deeper. No one knows if that actually is the right site, and no one has been inside because the Iranians have refused to allow the IAEA to even get access to that site. But the Iranians announced that that is that there is another secret, highly secure enrichment facility beyond Fordo. Right? And if that facility is fully operational, it's not really clear what even these strikes have accomplished in terms of setting back the program. Now, there is another piece. Always remember, nuclear weapons takes two things. You need to have the fissile material that is the explosive element of the bomb, which sets off the chain reaction. That's what we're talking about here with regard to Fordo and this possible new site and what's going on at Esfahan and Natanz as well. There is also the weaponization piece. And it's clear that the Israelis have been trying to go after the weaponization piece, right? The part of the Iranian program that is about making the explosive device itself. As I always point out, for those of you who saw Oppenheimer, that's what Oppenheimer and his team were up to at Los Alamos, is building the actual weapon itself. And that is hard. And we should remember that all of the estimates, including both American and Israeli estimates before any of this started, were that the Iranians were probably 6 to 12 months away from having the nuclear explosive itself. Right? And we don't know if those were right. And as I said, we don't know exactly what the Israeli campaign has done to that estimate, how much it has set it back, but that's clearly something else that the Israelis have been going after. Nonetheless, all this is saying that at the end of the day, Iran certainly has the capacity to reconstitute its nuclear program if it wants to do so, and it may be able to do that quickly. Right? And that brings up a series of different things that Brian was touching on, which is that this has got to become a critical element of the American and Israeli and hopefully European and Arab, Middle Eastern efforts moving forward. Is Iran, this regime in Iran has to be prevented from reconstituting its nuclear program and acquiring nuclear weapons. I won't go into it in too much detail, but one of the questions has already raised it. I think it's a very important one. Some of you have heard me make this point, but we need to recognize, remember the real lesson of Israel's 1981 strike against the Iraqi Osirak reactor, right? The mythology is that the Israelis mounted a brilliant airstrike against the Osirak reactor in 1981, destroyed the reactor. And the belief at the time was that this badly set back the Iraqi nuclear program. And even after, forever after, people believed that this strike was, one of the great boons to humanity because it meant that Iraq did not have a nuclear weapon when Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990. And therefore, we didn't have to fight against Iraq or consider fighting against a nuclear Iraq. What we found out after the Gulf War, and even more so after the US invasion in 2003, was the exact opposite. Was that in fact, the strike so infuriated Saddam Hussein that he began pouring resources into Iraq's nuclear program, and that it made far greater progress after the 1981 strike than it ever had beforehand. And that in fact, we were simply fortunate that Saddam Hussein was stupid enough to invade Kuwait and take on the United States of America in 1990-91 before he had a nuclear weapon. And Iraq's nuclear scientists, after the US invasion, all of them believed that Iraq probably would have had a nuclear weapon somewhere in the 1992 to 1995 timeframe had Saddam not foolishly invaded Kuwait and then invited the American campaign during Operation Desert Storm, which did ultimately end his nuclear program. Between that and the inspections that followed. And let's remember, it was the inspections that followed that did far more damage to his nuclear program than Desert Storm, because there was so much about his nuclear program that we didn't know about when we launched Desert Storm. Right, so this becomes a huge challenge. And, as Brian has pointed out, when you think about how do you keep Iran from reconstituting its nuclear program, it's probably going to require some very deft diplomacy coupled with the threat of force, possibly with some additional force, right? This is the kind of thing that is going to be so difficult because of the reasons that Alex pointed out, how little trust there is in this Iranian regime with the Trump administration. But as Brian pointed out, so far, the Trump administration has not demonstrated a capacity for that kind of deft diplomacy, mixing threat with diplomacy with actual uses of force. Perhaps they will rise to the occasion. We should all hope that they will, but this is kind of the situation that we find ourselves in. All right. We've got a lot of questions, and I want to get right to them. And Alex, I want to put one of the first questions right back to you because I think that it is important. And I should have also pointed out, emphasized the point that you made, which is that one of the things we don't know from the Iranians is, are we going to get a response out of emotion where they're angry and they lash out at the United States? Do we get a more strategic response from the Iranians, as you were starting to tease out? And it's worth noting that in the past, Ayatollah Khamenei has demonstrated himself to be prudent and strategic in his thinking. We can all point to instances where things have happened that probably really infuriated him, but he nonetheless responded from prudence and strategy. But even then, as you were pointing out in your remarks, he's got a variety of strategic considerations, right? He's got to think through, first of all, he doesn't know what the US is up to. We're saying we're not interested in regime change, but as you've pointed out, the Trump administration has, from the Iranian perspective, let's say, misled him on any number of occasions, not clear he can actually trust us. And therefore, does he believe it when the Trump administration says we're not going for regime change? Because obviously, if he believes we are, that's a very different set of strategic calculations for him. And in addition, even beyond that, there's going to be an impact of these strikes and America's entry into this on, as you pointed out, his own domestic political considerations, the wider populace. And so if he's thinking about those considerations, again, the strategic response might be different still. So some of the questions we're asking is about under what circumstances, and do you think that Iran is likely to try to do something like attack American personnel in the region or close the Strait of Hormuz? And just to say, apparently Press TV is claiming that the Majlis passed a measure saying that Iran should close the Strait of Hormuz, right? And there are a lot of problems just with what I said there. Coming from Press TV, it's the Majlis. This doesn't necessarily mean anything if it's even true. But again, let's start to unpack this a little bit. Under what circumstances, how Khamenei may be thinking about this, under what circumstances might the Iranians decide to mount those kinds of retaliations?
So, Ken, number one, to just recognize is he's never been in a place like this before, right? So this is really important. He's never had to deal. This is a man who would come out and say in public speeches very confidently, there will be no negotiations and there'll be no war. And look where that confidence has taken the country today. I mean, these are the types of criticism you're hearing. So Khamenei right now is, I'm assuming, bewildered in many ways. There is the assassination of senior members of the regime and the fact that he's in hiding, all the rest of it. But my bottom line on that question in terms of the likely desire, or if not, Khamenei being forced to be prudent as opposed to acting out of anger and emotional, I think it depends on that question I was raising at the end of my remarks. What is America's final objective in this? If it is regime change, but it's going to come at them slowly, not necessarily over the course of weeks, but months, and they detect there is something bigger at hand, maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu's repeated promise to the Iranian people that they soon will be free, there's actually something to it. It's not just empty bravado. If that's where the regime starts going in terms of their assessment and conclusions, then I think that's where you can see them trying to the extent they can, intimidate both United States and obviously Israel and everybody else in the region in terms of the consequences of a regime change policy being pursued by the United States. So you earlier mentioned the idea of Strait of Hormuz being closed. Strait of Hormuz has been mentioned as a place that will close going back to the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. That's a typical one. Why? Because 20-25% of the world's oil flows there, including Iran's. So it will have an impact. And that's one of those things when you regionalize, internationalize the conflict, when you make everybody suffer with you, Iran would hope, that makes it more likely that countries will pick up the phone, call President Trump and say, can you please stop the Israelis? So that's where we're going if regime change becomes what Iran considers to be the ultimate goal, because they're not going to listen to Trump when he says no regime change is on the cards. Because at this point, they probably think President Trump, if sold the idea that you will be the hero of the Iranian people, there will be regime change, just play along. Don't say anything. We have a game plan here. That's how the Iranians are looking at Trump. That essentially he's been taken along on this ride by Israel that has, so far in terms of its operations, certainly seems to have impressed President Trump, right? But can Israel finish the job? That's the question mark. The United States might have. So I don't think they will. I mean, I might be totally wrong. Of course, we're analysts sitting here watching the situation, but I would have thought when I look at the totality of this, retaliate, focus on Israel, don't give President Trump and the U.S. reason to enter this war, but recognizing the U.S. has been in this war with Iran from day one, right? The question is not given reason to sort of come out publicly and be in war with you, because then you have to deal with the psychological aspect of this. What does that do to the regimes, those people who are still fighting for this regime? Once the U.S. enters into the fray, there's a whole different psychology that's going to take over. Okay, this is a different ballgame. Fighting Israel, one thing. Fighting the United States, entirely different. So for that reason, it's also important to pretend that U.S. isn't in the fight. U.S. did something really terrible to us. It's undermined international law, all the rest of it. But let's keep them out for now. Let's focus on Israel. I think that's how they're going to go if they don't think regime change is the ultimate goal. But again, they might come to a different conclusion.
Yeah, great points, Alex. All right. So obviously, we've got some real ringers in the audience. And Brian, I'd like to pose a question to you from one of the ringers. I think it's a very important one, which is we haven't really talked about Israel yet.
Yeah.
And there are clear differences ultimately between what the Trump administration it seems to be looking for and what the Israeli government seem to be looking for, right? Trump administration is very focused on the nuclear issue, right? That's what they're going for. Obviously, the nuclear issue is critical to Israel, but Israel wants more than that. It seems clear the Israelis want limits or non-existence of Iranian ballistic missile forces. They're interested in Iran's regional activities, right? And so there's questions in Israel. People are raising this issue of should we actually go along with the kind of a deal that President Trump seems to want from Iran, which is narrowly focused on the nuclear issue. What do you make of that, Brian? Do you think the Israelis will go along with it? What would the U.S. have to do?
Yeah.
How does this create problems?
No, and I know the ringer you're talking about there, and it's a great question that's raised. The gap between the U.S. and Israel potentially, and maybe definitely the gap between Israel and some of the Arab Gulf states. And it made me think of, if you've ever been to the London Tube, the underground, mind the gap. I've been thinking about this for a while. There are big gaps here, not on the operational and tactical elements of the military operation that the U.S. just conducted or what Israel's been doing for the last 10 days. But I actually think there's grave potential for a huge gap if you look at just the public statements, the things we talked about from Trump to Vance to others, or Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State's first statement about the Israeli operation, which was, we're not involved, and essentially disassociating. And the Trump team has, I think, more or less disassociated themselves from any notion of regime change. They keep on saying that. That's not the case in terms of how I read the current Israeli government, right? The Israeli government has been hinting at certain things. And yes, going back to Trump, true to form with Trump, he hinted that he might kill the supreme leader if we wanted to. And, but this is true to Trump, basically saying everything and anything under the sun, just to confuse a lot of people. So this is a big concern that I have is how do you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Ken, not that I can pose a question to you. How do you get to some sort of cessation of hostilities where there's a damage assessment about what the capabilities are that remain so that you can then have a functional diplomatic conversation in the way that I was arguing, that it's not solely going to be the US and Iran. You need to bring some of the regional partners because it's their neighborhood and they have relations that we don't, and they have trust and confidence that we don't. So how do you actually execute that in short order if you want to get to that pathway? So I don't think, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think at that big strategic level, though Trump and Netanyahu seem aligned, I'm not certain that their teams are aligned on the comprehensive diplomatic strategic component of this. They seem to be on the military tactics right now, but it's a problem that we've had in the United States. It's a problem that Israel has in its own system of fixating on tactics, dealing with short-term threats, but then failing to actually come up with a comprehensive architecture that's sustainable, that deals with long-term threats and actually makes everybody safer. And that absence of a diplomatic component, what is the end state, the answer to the question? I would say, and this sounds like it's a toggle or a shift away from the Iran issue, it's not. I think it's interlinked. The problems Israel has had in articulating its end state on the Gaza war and on the Israel-Palestine file, and I think it's paralleled by the Trump administration not having a clue about what is an actual realistic positive end state on both of these two files. So I know there are good people in both systems, the Israeli and the current Trump administration system, trying to bridge these gaps, but I'm not confident that that's happening at the principles level. And in part because it comes back to the lack of clarity about the ultimate end motivation or end state that is defined here in terms of our friends in Israel, our partners, willing to live with the current regime as it now stands, with key constraints. I'm not certain that it's there. And then last thing I'd add to this, Ken, and it goes to this report Alex and I did with Patricia Karam in January, is that the one thing we're not talking about is Iran's presence in the region. It's much diminished, but I'm of the view that it's still operationally lethal and a big problem. And we'll see what Houthis and others might do. And one of the big shortcomings of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was that it deferred a lot of these issues while Iran continued to serve as a termite on regional security order. Again, we can't solve all of this. We certainly can't solve it within a U.S. administration that does not prioritize diplomacy in the way that I think it would. But I think there's a huge, again, close with this sound from the tube in London. Mind the gap between the U.S. and its partners, and understand that they're not all on the same page right now.
Yeah, it's a nice line, Brian. I'm going to pick up on a few things that you said and then pivot to answer some of the other questions out there. So first, and this isn't a disagreement with Brian, but I will simply make this point. The Israeli campaign so far is not designed to bring about regime change. Right? I have no doubt that the Israelis wouldn't mind seeing this regime collapse. But what they are doing so far is absolutely not about bringing a regime change. They'd be striking a completely different set of targets if they were going to do so. That said, it's very important because it gets at the same set of issues that Brian has brought up and brought up before, and that I also as well, which is that if you want to bring Iran to the negotiating table, if you want to get a deal from them, manipulation of the regime change threat is probably going to have to be a very important element of it. Right? The reason that the Israelis haven't been going after the actual regime set is to signal to the Iranian leadership, this is not about regime change. This is about obliterating your nuclear capability, some other military capabilities, but it is limited to that. But it is also, and I am quite confident that the Israelis have been back channeling this to the Iranian regime, we can expand to the regime change target set. We can pursue regime change if you do not do what we want you to do, or if you start doing things we don't want you to do. There's a tremendous amount of signaling that has been going on between the Israelis and the Iranians, mostly on the Israeli side, but it's clearly well received because the Iranians aren't doing things that they could do, which could make this much, much worse. Right. So we've got to recognize that this conflict, as frightening as it is to a lot of people, has actually been kept very discreet and very contained so far because the Israelis are absolutely aware of this and they've been very deft in how they've been handling things, and the Iranians are responding the way that they've wanted to do so. The U.S. is now involved in a very, very big way, right? And the diplomacy is now going to be much more about the United States. And if we're going to get to a good outcome of this conflict, both in terms of a ceasefire that everybody can agree with and a long-term state of affairs whereby this Iranian regime does not acquire nuclear weapons, that reconstitution piece, which is absolutely critical to the long-term determination of whether this war was useful, successful, however you want to put it, over the long term, it's going to require a similar deftness. It's going to be threatening regime change, but convincing the Iranian regime that we're not about regime change. And again, that's been made far more complicated by the U.S. entry into it because of the Iranian regime's problems with the Trump administration and all the issues that Brian and Alex have both raised in terms of how the Trump administration has handled Iran in the past. Okay, now, a lot of questions about Strait of Hormuz. Alex, I think, very nicely addressed the Iranian perspective on it. I just want to add a military strategic dimension, which is, could the Iranians close the Strait of Hormuz? Yes and no. In the short term, they could. Float some mines, start shooting it at commercial tankers, exactly the way that the Houthis did with the Strait, with the Bab el-Mandeb. And yes, you will see that traffic dry up immediately. Their problem is that they can't keep it closed. If they do something like that, it is highly likely that the United States would move to militarily reopen the Strait of Hormuz and probably do it with global approval. The strait is simply too important to the global economy. And again, war is never a certainty. There are always surprises, but especially given what we have seen from the Iranian military over the past year and a half, the limitations on their actual capabilities, the likelihood is that the U.S. Navy and Air Force will be able to reopen the Strait of Hormuz in short order. Could suffer some losses, could be some surprises, could get a little bit ugly, but probably in a matter of weeks, you will see the strait reopened and Iran's military forces near the strait absolutely eviscerated. And what's of greatest importance is that the Iranian leadership seems to understand that, and that they recognize that the threat to close the strait is actually much more useful to them than actually going ahead and closing it. And it seems most likely, no matter what the Iranian parliament may have said, that the regime is unlikely to even try unless they truly did believe that the regime's survival was itself threatened. Right? But again, can't be certain, and go back to the points that both Alex and I have already made, which is it's not entirely clear, and there probably are Iranians who are very afraid that that is exactly what the Trump administration plans, and that it simply cannot trust the word of the Trump administration. Okay, I want to put a set of questions to Brian. Brian, we have a ton of questions asking about the Russian and Chinese roles in this. And you're about as close we're going to get to an expert on Russia and China, how they may be thinking, in this one. We've got other folks who can do this, and perhaps we'll bring them on in future briefings. But we just have so many questions, and I think that it is an important thing to ask. Under what circumstances might we see Russian-Chinese involvement? In what ways could it be helpful? In what ways could it be counterproductive? Could it be harmful? Maybe those are better questions for you.
Yeah. So I think with Russia, and maybe Alex can chip in here as well, is that there's been increased cooperation. Obviously, Iran has been helping Russia in the Ukraine war with drone warfare. There's been a consolidation of that support, but I think there are severe limits to how much Russia, given its capacity constraints and the fact that it's focused on Ukraine, how far it would be willing to actually engage in here beyond the statements that we've heard in the opening hours condemning all of this. And it's really rich to me to hear them talk about the United Nations, right? To hear Moscow talking about international law, especially after the last couple of years in Ukraine. Anyone with their head screwed on straight who realizes that Russia invaded Ukraine not because we expanded NATO 20 years ago, but because it has its own imperial ambitions and actually is willing to break all sorts of rules. I wouldn't depend on Russia in any clear way. I think they have a propensity to try cause problems for the United States in different places, but I think they also have an interest as a major oil and gas producer. Perhaps you would talk about this as well, to see how outcomes stabilize and what happens in those dynamics. On China, again, I think this episode and the fact that I doubt how much leverage China has over some of the key parties here. I remember March 2023, we were in Saudi Arabia, a group of us from the Middle East Institute as part of a dialogue we have with partners there. And a few days after we came back, the big announcement of Saudi, Iran restoring diplomatic ties was issued in Beijing, right? And people were thinking, well, this means that China is really going to take over in some sort of way. And I don't see it. I see that they have economic interest, clearly energy supply interest. So back to your answer to the question on the Straits of Hormuz and the strategic military operation part of it, China has an interest in de-escalation, right? And seeing a pathway. And China also has an interest in developing strong ties with some of our close partners, which it has in Saudi Arabia and others, purely, mostly because of energy interest, but it also sees a longer term economic interest in that part of the world. We have two, when you step back from this crisis, Ken, you know this, we have two competing visions for that part of the world. China, it's Belt and Road Initiative, and the United States with the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, which Trump actually reaffirmed, which surprised me that he did that as a multilateral effort. But by and large, main point is that the United States is still the most influential actor, has the broadest network of partners across the region. What I don't think we have is a strategy to actually move things towards a diplomatic resolution. I don't see China or Russia filling in gaps, except for playing sort of roles that could try to stymie certain things or maybe helpful on the margins of things. But ultimately, I think the action is going to be between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And then I think with, as I keep on stressing, some of our close partners in the region who've become much more assertive diplomatically in their own right. And what I'm saying is we should try to marshal that to the benefit of stability and security in the region.
It's great. Okay, got a really interesting question for you, Alex. We've been talking a lot about, again, immediate horizontal responses from the Iranians. We've talked about the threat of reconstitution of the nuclear program, which is huge. We haven't really talked about Iran's long-term reaction in the region, right? Again, short-term in the region, long-term nuclear. We haven't really talked about long-term in the region. So again, how do you think, assuming that this regime survives, how do you think that this changes Iran's perspective on the region? Does it change it? How are they likely to respond in terms of their regional proxies and allies, but also their relations with other countries? How does that all change as a result of this?
Thanks, Ken. That's a great question. Very fundamental in many ways going forward, certainly for the Iranian leadership. But let me also very quickly tackle Russia, China. I want to bring them two together with the region. So I think I've been saying and writing for some time now of Iran's strategic loneliness, right? Iran is alone. Who is it going to call to come to its aid? Bibi Netanyahu can call Trump. Ali Khamenei cannot call Putin. He can call Putin, have a nice chat, but that's not going to result in much, right? Khamenei has spent the last 20 years at least, certainly since Mahmoud Ahmadinejad came in cultivating this notion of look east. Russia and China will save us against these people from the West. 20 years is gambled on look east, which has at times resulted in some nice headlines. Iran joins the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran joins BRICS. Oh, Iran and Russia and China have military drills in the Arabian Sea. And then the war erupts, and who's missing in action? Russia and China, right? They have done nothing. I mean, I shouldn't say. The one thing they have done is apparently the Russians told the Israelis, don't hit Bushehr nuclear power plant. We have 200 or so Russians working there. But I bet you probably the Israelis were more worried about the Gulf reaction if they did hit Bushehr because of the potential radioactive contamination in the water, which would put water security across the Gulf at risk since they rely on that water for desalination plants. So I have nothing to point to in terms of other than words that have come from Russia, which, it's a question mark for the Russians if they want to play this game of standing up to the United States. They haven't been, I mean, this is following right after a few months after Assad fell. And now this, I mean, Russia and China, question marks. But I'll tell you this, Ken, if the regime survives, I can also see Russia, China having real interest in deepening down, helping Iran survive, because it becomes a pride moment for the Axis, if you will, for the anti-liberal, the autocracies out there that are ganging together. This is a test case. They have maybe failed, they have failed during this war as it's going on. But if the regime survives, they might have reason to go back and actually help the Iranians to the extent they can. Which brings me to your question, Ken, about, again, strategic loneliness is not just Russia and China can't help Iran. What about Iran's proxies in the region? And this isn't a new debate. This debate has been going on in Iranian circles for some time. What are we doing in the Arab world? Why are we fighting Israel? What is the national interest for us to risk so much when we could have had a nuclear program left to our own devices if we didn't go out there and scream and shout, the sort of slogans that Khamenei and his supporters have done? So there is a fundamental moment here. If Khamenei survives the war, I don't know if he's going to step down. Some people are suggesting that maybe that's the best course of action. But I do wonder if he can stay the course, even he still believes in this dogma of anti-Americanism, anti-Israel. But I also suspect there's a moment right now for certainly people who are waiting in the wings to come in and take over to actually revisit this issue, looking at the fact that the proxies really, when it came to it, couldn't do anything. I don't know if the Iranians have called them to come to war. Maybe they haven't, because as I said, they're trying to limit this war to between Iran and Israel. But I do have real questions if they did call on what's left of the axis of resistance, what they can actually do to change the outcome of the military conflict, which really now raises fundamental questions about the forward defense strategy. Is it worth keeping at this point? Maybe it's time to try your hands at a new doctrine. Let me stop there, Ken. I know we're almost out of time.
Yep, that's great, Alex. I'll give a 30-second answer to one last question, which Brian's already talked about. It's this issue of the current bureaucracy and how Trump has handled it. And I will simply say that the president can always give orders to the military will execute them. The president can give orders to someone like Steve Witkoff, he'll go execute them. What's really missing without this process, though, is the ability to consider second, third order issues, and in particular to identify and deal with unintended consequences. All right, think for everyone in the audience about all of America's adventures and misadventures in the Middle East over the last 40 years, and how many of the problems came up as a result of unintended consequences. As someone who just finished a huge book on the history of the US and Iraq, what is striking to me is not only how many of the problems were from unintended consequences, but how frequently those unintended consequences were identified, and not by just one lone person. They were identified by large numbers of people in the US bureaucracy, and then they were ignored. If you don't have the process, no one is identifying the unintended consequences. It's one thing to identify them and ignore them. In many other cases, the US identified those unintended consequences and did something about it. Those were our successes. But our mistakes were typically because we ignored those unintended consequences. In this administration, I fear that we just won't even acknowledge those unintended consequences. I'm afraid we've got to wrap up here. This was perhaps the fastest hour of all of the briefings that we've done. So much more to talk about. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Alex. You guys have been fantastic. And for everybody else who's been participating, just to let you know, we're going to do another virtual briefing tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. by Zoom. It will again be on the record and open to the public. We will have General Joe Votel, former CENTCOM commander, Dan Ben-Nayem, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Persian Gulf, and Colby Connolly, energy expert, to again talk through more aspects of current events. Thank you all very much, and see hopefully all of you tomorrow.